My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And sometimes we'll go at the microscope with a chainsaw because, it's funny.
Beeper, there are no words to describe the feelings I have towards you right now for proposing this episode topic.
Oh, come on. The people want to know. It's, we covered cult classic movies. Why wouldn't we cover cult classic video games?
You're right. That is totally fair. For people who don't know what we're talking about, this week we're discussing the video game Conker's Bad Fur Day. If you've never heard of this video game before, you will learn some interesting things before this episode is done. So, Beaver, I distinctly remember being introduced to Conker's Bad Fur Day through you. You were one of those people in the 2010s still playing the N64. I remember you being almost like an evangelist for classic Super Smash Brothers and then this Conker's Bad Fur Day thing. So, please, you're probably the one with the secret origin here. So what's the scoop? How did you come to discover this game?
Oh, man. It's a long, long time ago. I did not have a Nintendo 64 growing up. And so I played at my friend's house. And one day, a friend of my friend came one night because we used to hang out a lot. We were on the same bus route, so we do that thing that I don't think anybody's allowed to do anymore, where we just get off at each other's bus stop and hang out until our parents came to pick us up at each other's house. So sometimes there'd be other friends that weren't mutual friends, and one day, Conker's Bad Fur Day was brought in, and we didn't play any of the actual game, like the campaign, because there were a few of us, so we played the multiplayer version, or one of the multiplayer games. Specifically, I distinctly recall the one where you could either play as the cavemen trying to steal eggs from the dinosaurs or the dinosaurs trying to eat the cavemen. And I don't know, something about that always stuck with me. And then I just remember, after I got an N64 in high school, so I was really late to the party, I started looking for games that I had vague memories of. Because that's how I found Rampage World Tour, because I remembered playing that game. It's a game where you're giant things destroying buildings, and one of the games I looked for, and Google was super useful at that point, was a game where dinosaurs eat cavemen for the N64, and I eventually found it, and also found articles about it, and found that it had kind of an infamous reputation, and I did not find my own copy for a while, but I had a friend who had it and who let me borrow it, and I played it, and it was a magical, hilarious experience of just complete insanity and irreverentness, and it was so different from everything else that I'd actually pretty much different from any video game I've ever played, and different from pretty much any media that existed at the time, and I loved it. And then I started trying to look for my own copy, and that took about 7 years. I actually remember I had like a few like used video game stores had me on a list to call if the game ever came in, and I got the call. I came in like I was there 45 minutes after I got the call cuz I was in university. I didn't have classes that day. And there was another guy in the store who bought the first copy they got in. I bought the second. And about five, like by the time I was done paying for mine and was heading out the store, there was somebody else who came in asking for it. So, a lot of people were looking for this, and I'm quite happy that I managed to snatch a copy. And then, I played it, introduced it to my friends because I feel like it is a game that can be fun to play alone, but it's definitely a lot more fun to introduce to other people.
All right, so immediately I have some concerns because this game, as we're going to discuss, is not intended for children. It was clearly marketed towards adults. It literally says right on the box, this game is not intended for children. So are
Yep.
you telling me that you were playing this game, like someone bought this game for one of your friends when arguably they shouldn't have?
Oh, absolutely. Like there is a part of me that's glad I only ended up finding it again in high school because it is definitely not a game meant for kids, but it has that kind of that very preteen, early teen humor. Plus some for a few more things that are less appropriate, but like there are parts of it that do appeal to kind of not a childlike sensibility, but like a very childish sense of humor. The first boss is a singing pile of poop. Like that's just potty humor. It's funny in an immature way.
My second question, why, like by the time we were in high school, like the Nintendo Wii was a thing. So why were you looking for an N64?
Couple of reasons. You talked about me being kind of an evangelist for the original Super Smash Brothers. I was really bad at the other versions of the game, but it was a super popular game, so I wanted to have a version of the game I was actually good at. Um, that was one of the factors, but the other one, I didn't have any attachment to the Wii. We actually had a Wii because my mom wanted to get the Wii Fit, and we got Rock Band Beatles, and I think like the only games I ever played extensively was Twilight Princess, but even there, it was my sister bought it, and then I beat the bosses for her, and she beat the levels. And I still have it. I didn't play it that much, but I tried to because it had a cool gimmick. Was Budokai Tenkaichi, the Dragon Ball Z fighting game that came out for the Wii, where like you would take the Wii remote and like pull it back to do a Kamehameha, which was terrible and super wonky and did not work well at all. So I kind of got bored of it pretty quickly. And so those were the games I had. I think we had Lego Indiana Jones, but the Wii just didn't appeal to me. And so I went back to something I had always wanted and had very fond memories of, both from friends and a few of my cousins having one when I was a kid. And I got an N64. Um, Almost got an Xbox, but again, there was less I remembered enjoying with it. So, we had a whole episode about nostalgia last week. It's 100% nostalgia.
Interesting. Well, diving into the secret origin for Conker's Bad Fur Day itself, this brings us back to the video game company Rare, or sometimes they seem to be called Rareware. We talked about this, some time ago when we talked about James Bond video games, but
Right.
Rare was a British video game company that had a lot of success making games for the Nintendo 64. A lot of games that arguably are like classics on that console were developed by Rare.
As
And
well
then
as Donkey Kong Country before that.
yeah, Donkey Kong Country, they did GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, just to name a few of the games that they were responsible for.
Gex Enter the Gecko.
I think they did like Pitch Dark or Perfect Dark or
Perfect Dark, yeah.
some game like that as well. So they had variety. Like they had games that were, more animal fun things for kids, and then they also did more, I guess, violent, more mature games.
I mean, kind of, but at the same time, like even the shooters that Rareware did were not considered some of the more violent ones, right? Like you had Doom, you had Duke Nukem, like you had some things for the N64 that were definitely a lot more violent than GoldenEye and Perfect Dark were.
So today, Rare is owned by Microsoft, and they just sort of develop things just for the Xbox now. So they're kind of not, they don't have the level of prominence they did back in the
I thought
90s.
Nintendo got them back.
The last I heard, they were still making stuff for Microsoft. But if there's anyone out there who has the answer to this, please let us know. So Conker is a squirrel, and if you look at the character design for him, he looks very much like a Nintendo character. Like he looks like he would fit in very well in a Mario Party kind of game.
Yeah, or I think the design was a bit more rare than Nintendo though. Like he would fit very well with Banjo Kazooie, Diddy Kong, Donkey Kong, and Gex, and a few others that because they did have a slightly different design to them. I feel like the rare characters were a little bit more Japanese inspired, if that makes sense. Like they had kind of more exaggerated features and bigger eyes and a little bit cutesy, kind of.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Conker, he was first developed for a 3D platforming game for the N64, which was originally announced in 1997 to be Conker's Quest. And to promote this upcoming game, they actually inserted Conker as a playable character in Diddy Kong Racing, which came out that same year in 1997. Apparently, that's also how Banjo and Kazooie were introduced. Those games were being developed simultaneously, and Rare wanted to promote their upcoming games, so they inserted them all as playable racers, basically in Diddy Kong Racing.
Yeah, which is something Rare was good at doing, was using their already successful things. I don't know, like I feel like in the Nintendo 64 era, they did a lot of things, probably because quite a few of those games, like you said, were being developed at the same time. Because like in Conkers, there are two umbrellas that have Banjo and Kazooie's faces on the handles in the opening menu, and there are little Easter eggs here and there that kind of refer the games to one another.
But Conker's Quest unfortunately ran into issues. It was kind of just meant to be like a Mario 64 game where you just have this open world and you're going around doing stuff. At that point, the game was very much meant to be for kids, and it seemed like nobody was really excited about this poor game. It got renamed as the 12 Tales of Conker, and as it was being developed and being kind of promoted through the E3 conference, it seemed to a lot of people that it was very similar to Banjo Kazooie, which was, again, still in development. But then by the time Banjo Kazooie came out, they felt there was a great need to shift the focus of what this Conker game was going to be, because it was appeared to be too
Yeah.
much of the same.
Well, especially with Banjo Kazooie being like hitting some very high levels of popularity, but also being what I think was like most people would consider a very solid platformer. Like a lot of people who look at this game do nitpick that they just made the game longer by adding a million collectibles, which there is a truth to, but at the same time, it was like it had in a similar way that Donkey Kong 64 did. It had like different characters that could move in different ways that would unlock different parts of the map. And you did have to use kind of more precise movement and platforming to get around, which I think was kind of very good. And yeah, it would seem a little weird to just do something that's the same right after, especially as we'll talk about when I don't know if the controls for Conkers were any better at that point in development, but they ended up being a little bit wonky in the end.
So technically, the first official Conker game that was released was called Conker's Pocket Tales for the Game Boy. It came out in 1999, and I guess if you played the Game Boy like Classic or Game Boy Color version, the game was a little different in how it was laid out, but it was more or less the same game. So Conker's Bad Fur Day, the game we're actually talking about today, some might think of it as the only video game that Conker is in, but in fact, he was in Diddy Kong Racing as a playable character, and then his Game Boy game, which was originally put into development at the same time as the Conker's Quest, it just happened to actually get finished faster because the concept didn't change.
And I do believe that eventually Conker's 12 Tales was released, but I think for the Xbox after Microsoft purchased it.
Yeah, I think they did like a remastered version of Conker's Bad Fur Day for the Xbox that might have included more of the elements that were going to be part of 12 Tales. But it sounds like the way the story goes is that there was a guy named Chris Seaver who was working at Rare, and he just sort of came up with a totally different direction for the Conkers game to make it more distinct from the Banjo-Kazooie games or just really anything else Rare was doing. And so there's a part of the game where there's a beehive, and like then the game mechanic is you have to collect a beehive that has been stolen by some wasps. The queen bee has like commissioned you to go and like save her beehive and bring it back to her. So one of the game people like came up with this concept, and then Chris Seaver had this idea of introducing more of a narrative to this, like, okay, what's the reasoning behind, like, why is this happening? And then decided to inject violence and humor into the situation. And they sort of presented this scene as a demo to the leadership of Rare and Nintendo. And this was like their, I guess, test case to say, like, hey, like, this is what we want to do with this game. For those who haven't played the game, at the very end, when the queen bee gets her beehive back, it all of a sudden turns into like this machine gun turret, and she just sort of climbs into it and basically murders all of the wasps that have been who had stolen from her.
And yeah, I think one of the nice things about kind of like the concept that went in with that is that they kind of ran with some of those like storylines that yes end in violence and a little bit of a shock, but they did add that into the final game when earlier in the game, like once it was fully developed earlier in the game, the night before, actually you do get a cutscene where in the background you see the wasps flying away with the beehive, and that you do kind of get a little bit more of it. They also added the fact that the beehive was stolen because the queen bee's husband was not around for reasons we may get into. um, and like they did start building up, yeah, like you said, a lot more of a narrative than just having like one main quest and everything you do kind of goes towards it. Just something a lot of their games like Banjo Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64, it is like one big quest, whereas Conker's Bad Fur Day is more like trying to do a bunch of side quests in order to perhaps get to where you want to go.
Now, Beeper, being as big a fan of this game as you are, does it surprise you that it was a demonstration of the beehive scene that led to them actually giving the game a green light?
Yes and no. I think like it is one of the areas that kind of works somewhat independently and gives you kind of a good idea of what the game is for, while still being like, other than the amount of blood that comes out of the wasps when you shoot them, I think that generally it was a pretty good kind of scene to have, and it wasn't over the top like a lot of the other scenes end up being. So I'm not overly surprised, although I wonder if the dialogue, which kind of happens at the beginning and at the end, were part of the original display for it, because it like, I don't know, it's the dialogue is part of like kind of like the humor that makes it a little bit unique, but also because there's the dialogue and then there's like Conker gets these thoughts bubbles where he's basically insulting everybody as he's talking to them.
So we, of course, welcome Jam Jam to the show. I'm hoping she has not heard of this game yet.
No, she will not until she is a mature person, as the rating would indicate.
So when Conker's Bad Fur Day was announced in 2000 as the game it was meant to be, there were a lot of people who actually thought it was like some kind of April Fool's joke. Like they didn't think that Rare and Nintendo would actually go ahead and make a game full of like cute cartoon creatures that was basically very violent and crude.
That I can definitely believe. I mean, it was such a strange departure from what they usually do, but at the same time, like I think the people who made it clearly had a lot of fun and clearly had a vision for what they wanted, and they wanted it to be different, and they went for it. Sometimes maybe a little harder than they should have, but it's part of like I think that, this game does go beyond just the shock factor of that. Like there was definitely effort put at least into the storytelling of it. Maybe not as much effort as might have been needed on some of the gameplay or mechanics, but at the same time, again, they were trying new things with these mechanics, and they were trying to get something that didn't feel like every other video game they have made, and I think that deserves, a lot of respect.
Yeah, and I am surprised they took the risk, because I feel like especially now Nintendo has such an image of being like the family friendly video game company. Maybe it was less of a thing in the 90s, but still it was kind of surprising that they were like totally fine with this.
I mean, they didn't really have any rivals in the 90s except for Sony, and even there, it's still like at that point, like the Xbox hadn't come out yet, right? Or
No, but
no, the
Sega
Xbox
was a
hadn't come out.
thing.
Yeah, Sega was a thing, but the PlayStation 2 was like only a small step above the Nintendo 64, and Nintendo was currently developing the GameCube, which, until the PS3 came out, which was around the time of the Wii, Sega would kind of be left in the dust for most of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, right? So I think it is like, yes, definitely they have a lot more of that reputation now, but that's also, we have to remember also PC gaming wasn't really a thing at the time. Like consoles were the only way to get video games, so they had a lot closer to a monopoly at the time, and I think that made it a little easier to go for the more risque games.
And I will give Nintendo and Rare credit. They went out of their way to make sure that kids didn't hear about this game. Like they intentionally only marketed it to adults. In fact, when they had like a live demo at E3 for people to try the game out, they also had a bar where you could get like alcoholic beverages, and you had to show like ID to get into this like Conker's demo area. So they, even when they were promoting it at like their events, they were making it so that kids couldn't get in by serving alcoholic beverages. And then what I found shocking, I learned today that Nintendo actually partnered with Playboy to promote the game. Like they would travel to college campuses and like essentially set up like a opportunity, like little booths, I guess, where college students could get a chance to play the game. And
That
they advertise it in like more adult oriented magazines.
that doesn't even surprise me a little bit. Like, I mean, look, given like the brand of humor that's in the game and some specific jokes in it too, it makes a lot of sense to go with Playboy, as well as the character design of most of the female characters. But I think it is definitely, I think, still today a game that has more appeal to like people in college, people who are like, this is kind of dumb and funny and immature, but in a way that we're okay with, and while still having some mature content. And I mean, like you said, talking about the bar, I mean, the game starts in a bar. Like the opening menu is in fact the inside of a bar where Death is drinking himself to death. And there's a few people, and Conker is drunk at the beginning of the game and gets a hangover. Like the first scene, he has a hangover that you need to cure before you can go on with the rest of the game. So it seems like a logical way to try to advertise the game.
But I'm like realizing even now it's kind of odd, because I feel like console gaming at that point was still mostly targeted to children. So the fact that they went to so many lengths to market this game towards adults, Like, I wonder how many grown men and women were actually playing an N64 like at that point, like in the year 2000.
Well, like Nintendo had been along and in the console game long enough that you could have, college students who had grown up playing the consoles and had brought them or gotten a new one when they were in college, right? Like at that point, the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo Entertainment System had been around for long enough that if you had one as a kid, you could in, the late 90s, early 2000s be in college and have played Nintendo games as a kid. And so I don't know, I think it was probably, it might, I don't know how it fits in the history of video games, but it feels like it might have just been a gambit too, like a commercial gambit to try to get, the college crowd more into consoles and trying to get it beyond just kids, because that is a big market that like video games still target that demographic pretty heavily, right? Like obviously still children, but a lot, but like you said, Nintendo kind of has the market on more child-friendly games right now, so everybody else is targeting more of that demographic.
So in the end, after all this promotion, Conker's Bad Fur Day was released on the Nintendo 64 in mid 2001. And for people who know their video game history, the Nintendo GameCube was released towards the end of 2001, which means that Conker's was really one of the final games to get a release on the Nintendo 64. And people who are looking back on the history will say that that is part of why the game didn't do well financially. Like, people were not really interested in the N64 anymore because they were ramping up to anticipation for the GameCube.
Yeah, and I mean that is completely fair. I think also, like we said, it was a gambit, and that probably also worked to its disadvantage commercially. It was something new. It was something different. It was something that people weren't expecting. So I like, yes, that did contribute to the fact that it didn't do very well, but in a weird way, kind of contributed also to it becoming a cult classic, right? Because they didn't make as many copies because it didn't sell well and the N64 wasn't selling anymore. So it did contribute to making it harder to find and harder to get, right? Which is something that definitely, like I said, I looked for that game for 7 years before I found a copy of it. Now, I wasn't actively looking all of those years. Like, it's only towards the last couple that I was actually like trying to go to different stores to find one, but it still is a pretty rare game to have.
I just had a thought. What if, instead of being one of the final N64 games, what if this was like one of the launch titles for the GameCube? I wonder if that would have done anything to actually like help it be more successful.
Possibly, but at the same time, Nintendo has a pretty long tradition of releasing like a Zelda game, a Mario game, and then one version of like their party games, like either Mario Kart or Mario Party. Like, those are always the first releases for consoles, right? Like, it would have felt really strange for them to suddenly throw in this game. And I could be wrong, but I think that the dealings um to hand Rareware over to Microsoft had begun at that point, because it is shortly afterwards that it happened.
Well, unless we develop time travel, we'll never really know the answer. But we've talked all about the history and how this game got released. So let's just start talking about the game itself. Give us the, I guess, back of the N64 box description for Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Meet Conker the squirrel. He's small, he's cute, and he's vicious. He's trying to get home, kind of hungover. He had a night out with the boys. They're going to war tomorrow. Told his girlfriend so, and now he just wants to get home, but it's not working, so he'll help other people as long as they pay him, defeat anybody who stands in his way in violent ways, and eventually become the king.
Now, this is a game with swearing in it, with shots of cows taking prune juice induced dumps. There's
Before being
scenes.
eviscerated by a bull.
Yeah, there are well-endowed sunflowers. There are all kinds of things that you would not necessarily expect from a video game with a cartoon squirrel as the lead. And
No, it's also got Bram Stoker's Dracula parody, as well as a Matrix parody in it, as well as a Terminator parody, and a kind of a little bit of Saving Private Ryan parody.
yeah, there are an abundance of segments of the game that are references to movies. This game has a lot of cutscenes in it where, it's just the characters talking. And yeah, there's literally like a recreation of the beach scene from Saving Private Ryan. It's uncanny. Like I watched a video today kind of showing all the references from movies in Conkers, and yeah, they almost, the beach scene, which of course if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, it's how the movie begins. It's a very famous movie scene. Like there's even like people, like squirrels dying underwater, squirrels running around on fire. Like it's all stuff straight out of that movie.
Yeah, and the final boss is literally the alien from Aliens. Like it is the final scene. You're in the same mech suit as Ripley in uh, in Aliens, the second Alien movie, and you're fighting off against a xenomorph.
Yeah, there's like the opening of the game. It's like it's like directly adapting A Clockwork Orange to the point where the character's even sitting there drinking a glass of milk. As a movie person myself, that does, like, the fact there's all these fun movie references, it does kind of make the idea more exciting to play. Some of the references are more timeless, like there's a Wizard of Oz reference at one point. Some of them are more really, I guess, dated to that late 90s 2000s period. Like there's a moment that pays homage to the American Godzilla movie. There's a scene clearly like parodying the Matrix.
Oh, I think the Matrix has gotten has gotten enough of a following that one's a little more timeless, especially because like it's not, well, there is one scene, like one cutscene with bullet time, but they also have like the slow motion shooting while going through the air, which honestly is one of the best part of the game. It's just so much fun to play that level.
Now, at this point, would you say the movie references and whatnot are like a distraction? Do they feel dated, or do you feel like they can improve the experience?
I think that like a lot of them, some of them are dated, but most of the ones that are dated are slightly more not obscure, but well, yeah, they are like not obscure like the movie is obscure, but the references are a little more difficult to catch on to. Like, the obvious references that I can think of are like the Matrix, Aliens, The Godfather. Like those are pretty timeless movies. And again, because because the game has such a weird sections to it, and all the sections have kind of like different people who want different things. I feel like the movies don't really distract from it because it is already kind of a hodgepodge of different things. Like you go directly from a prehistoric world to a club that turns into a Godfather parody that turns into a Matrix parody almost seamlessly because it is still connected by story threads. And I think that's the fun thing, is that even though none of it should make sense, there is still a coherent story in this game, and this grand story happening in the background that has nothing to do with the main character but ends up affecting him.
Yeah, I from what I understand, part of the impetus of the plot is there's this King Panther who, he just wants to drink milk off his side table, but one of the legs from his side table is missing. So his scientist tells him, "Oh, we can replace the missing leg on your side table by getting a red squirrel and having them be the leg for the table."
Yeah, and that's the only reason Conker ever interacts with the fairy Panther King, or fabled Panther King, and but it also kind of interweaves into other parts of the plot, because like the mad scientist who determines that the red squirrel is needed to fix the table is also the person who created the army of teddy bears you fight in the Saving Private Ryan / Mission Impossible part of it. So it feels like a world where, much more than a lot of video games of that time, that everybody kind of has their own story and you're just kind of interacting with it rather than it all being about you.
Yeah, so this is a game that definitely has shock value when you're playing it. It's, I mean, a lot of it comes from the cutscenes because that's where you hear the most of characters just talking. And there's like speech bubbles too, so there's no ambiguity about what they're saying. Like you can clearly see the swear words. They I guess they draw the line at the F word. Like anytime they're, I guess, saying the F word, it is intentionally bleeped out and you can't see what it's being said. But
But at the same time, there is a character who, if you're standing idle in the room at about every 20 seconds, will say it, even though it's bleeped out.
I've heard some people say it's almost disarming playing the game because you, unless you know what you're getting, you won't expect some of the humor and some of the comments. And you know, like you mentioned, there's the great big poo monster who sings opera. There's like a whole level dedicated to like swimming in poop and creating a giant ball of poo. And depending on who you are, you might find that hilarious. You might find it disgusting.
But I think, but I think even people who go into it expecting it to, like, unless specific parts of it have been spoiled, it still has a lot of, like, if not shock factor, at least surprises. Like, you fight these bales of hay and then discover that there's a bigger bale of hay, and once you defeat him, it turns out that he's actually a Terminator type creature that just had a bale of hay on top of him, and that just comes out of nowhere. And even if you know there's movie references and there's violence, it just seems really weird to suddenly have that there. And I do think there is definitely something charming and disarming about it, especially because, just before fighting the Haybot, you're kind of, you're trying to gather some bees. I mean, to be fair, the reason you're trying to gather the bees is to tickle the well-endowed sunflower so that you can bounce on her to get some money. But it's, and saying these things sounds really weird, but that's, I think the beauty of this game is that it works.
Now, would it surprise you to find out that all of the dialogue in the movie was complete, or the movie? I'm talking about like if this is a movie, and then that's honestly what it kind of feels like. But would it surprise you to learn that all of the dialogue was improvised?
No, not really. Like there's a lot of the dialogue that's good, but I know that there's also like a lot of inside jokes in the dialogue. Like in one of the first cutscenes, you're talking to the Scarecrow and he's telling you he needs Mexi Packs, which is just their way of saying Pepsi Max, because apparently a lot of the programmers were drinking Pepsi Max while making the game, and they just thought it was a funny story a funny joke to make. And then I think that would also explain some of the random movie references, because that Scarecrow also makes a reference to Full Metal Jacket, which is really kind of a deep cut reference for any game to have in it, right? So I think, yeah, it's not surprising, and it does make for some hilarious things. And again, I think really goes into the fact that these people clearly had fun making this game. Like, this was like, regardless of the glitches that may have had happened, overall, this is the game they wanted to make.
And the game benefits from being something that came out towards the end of the N64's lifespan, because it really got to maximize the best that console could produce. So people have praised the animation on the characters and the coloring and the textures on the backgrounds and the quality of the music and the fact that there is full-on voice acting in the game, even though it's just like a handful of people doing different voices. Like it's literally just the game developers doing the voices. Like,
and it's really obvious that it's only a few people doing the voices too. Like, they were not professional voice actors. They didn't have great differentiation, but it doesn't really deter from it. And yeah, like you said, like, a lot of, like, yeah, the background art is really well done, and the music, like, it has that N64 Rareware era music feel to it that, like, Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, they all have kind of similar music, but it sounds really good, and a lot of them have become kind of classics. So, it is really fun, and I still listen to some of the background tracks from that game on loop.
Now, of course, the problem with humor and comedy is that it's subjective, and therefore, what one person will find funny, someone else will not find funny. And the other problem with comedy is that, you're always kind of on the cutting edge of like what's acceptable or what can be made fun of, whatever. So I found an interview with Chris Seaver, who was again the lead developer, kind of the brainchild behind this game from more recent, like in the last couple of years. And there's one particular quote he has that Beeper, if you have it in front of you, I'd love for you to recite this for us. And he's British, so use a British accent.
Right then. I mean, I played it fairly recently, and I'm shocked at some of the stuff. I probably would change some of the stuff now. And you'd have a hard time getting it made now.
Yeah, he later on the interview, he adds that point in there that you'd have a hard time getting this game made now. And he also made a point of saying, it's like, you probably wouldn't want us to make, if they made another Conker's game, you wouldn't want us to make it because he makes a point saying, I'm a different person now. What I find funny is different now. And if you were like hoping for more of the same, you wouldn't get that with us.
No, I think definitely you would want, if you wanted to make a new Conkers, like kind of in the spirit of the original, you'd get a bunch of like new younger developers who are really into Rick and Morty to make it.
Yeah, so we've alluded to this sunflower. He highlighted that's one thing he would totally just take out altogether. From what I understand, there's some jokes about suicide. There's these cogs that there's like male and female cogs, and I guess the way that they're used in the game, it's making a joke about sexual assault, which of course is like not something that people would think as funny anymore.
Yeah, there's also a very homophobic point in the cogs section. And yeah, no, there are definitely some things that have not aged well. And yeah, the cogs is probably the biggest one. I think the sunflower was just kind of a funny thing to have in, but it does have nothing to do with anything else. And some of the dialogue that they improvised maybe a little bit much, because there's a part of the dialogue between the king bee and the flower where you can't see them, but from the facial expression that Conkers is making while watching them, and from the dialogue, you get a pretty good idea of inappropriate things happening.
Now, have you ever seen the animated series Drawn Together?
I have not, but I know what it is.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, there's this animated show called Drawn Together, and it is an animated series that aired on like MTV or some network. It wasn't meant for kids. It's very much an adult cartoon, and they poke fun at like basically all different kinds of animation. So there's like a girl who is meant to be a stand-in for a Disney princess. There's a character who's clearly like meant to be a stand-in for SpongeBob SquarePants. There's someone who's meant to be a stand-in for like Superman from the Justice League show. There's a
Betty
character.
Boop.
Yeah, there's a Betty
Popeyes,
Boop stand-in. There's a Josie and the Pussycats character stand-in. Like there's all these different types of animated characters that are kind of living in a house like Big Brother. And it has a very similar style of humor to this, where it's just crass, and you constantly look at the screen. You're like, I can't believe that they're doing this. Like they're making all kinds of jokes. They're swearing. There's sexual content. All kinds of things that you just wouldn't. I guess it's more jarring because it is animated and it's drawn in a way to look like animation meant for children. And again, it was made around the same time, like the early 2000s, and some of the more risque humor, I really don't think if they made it now, they'd be able to get away with it. And I bring it up in comparison to Conkers because for me, myself, it's hard. I have a hard time overlooking, I guess, the parts that are more difficult to swallow. I think with Conkers, again, having not played the game myself, it seems like the parts that haven't aged well are more in the minority than when I think of Drawn Together.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that by the nature of the game, a lot of things that haven't aged well are in cutscenes, which you can skip the second time. And a lot of the thing, again, because the game just jumps from style to style very quickly, you don't really dwell on a lot of them. Like, every joke is pretty short, so you don't have a lot of time for the inappropriate jokes to kind of stick to you or last too long. Like, it's, yeah, like, obviously, if you couldn't skip the cutscenes after the first time, that'd be kind of, it might get a little jarring, but you usually do that. And also, a lot of the parts that are highly inappropriate are parts that are like at the end of having finished something, which means that there's no reason to go back to it. Like, it's not something where you're gonna there's something really inappropriate, then you die and you'd have to restart that section. That doesn't happen very often. So I think that might be, part of why it works as well, because you never really dwell on, some of the weirder jokes. And yeah, I do think a lot of the jokes aren't that bad, and also a lot of them, again, are placed in the context of movie parodies, which people tend to be like, yeah, I recognize that. Like, there's a weasel who beats another weasel to death with a baseball bat. You don't see it happening, you just see the blood splurt and everybody looking at it. But it's in the middle of a parody of The Godfather, so you're kind of expecting this, right? And it's the same thing with the Saving Private Ryan scene. Like, it's clear what this is a reference to, so the amount of violence, even in, a bunch of cute animated squirrels dying, doesn't feel as jarring.
And apparently that specific moment where the guy's being killed with a baseball bat, that's actually a reference to a gangster movie called The Untouchables.
You're right, it is. But the overall scene is a reference to The Godfather.
Yes.
Because even the music, even like, and that's one of the things they did do too. They took a lot of like similar musical cues, like not similar enough to get sued, but similar enough that you would recognize the movie, which is like there's a shark, like a bulldog shark that gets a Jaws type theme, and you get a lot of different music. Like the music from the Matrix scene is, very techno, sounds very similar to the type of music that was in the original Matrix without exactly being the Matrix.
Now, this is a video game, and I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about like the world and the story and the humor. So I'm going to ask you some gameplay questions based on what I heard people talking about. One person really complained about the camera in this game.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Considering it came out at the end of the N64 era, and there were a lot of other 3D platformers. Oh, yes. Okay. Jam Jam agrees with me. There were a lot of 3D platformers that had done a very good job at fixing the camera angle problems, but like, I don't think the cameras is any worse than Donkey Kong 64 or Super Mario 64. It's definitely much worse than something like the Zelda games, both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, but they specifically made a mechanic to make it really easy to change the camera angle. Donkey Kong 64 tried to do it, but then it would still change when you move out of the mode to change it, which was kind of bad. But like, yes, it is pretty bad, but it's not terrible for a Nintendo 64 game.
I heard someone complain about the fall damage being very aggressive in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be very annoying, and I think like generally if you go into this game expecting to go through it without dying several times, like, you're crazy for a couple of reasons. And I mean, one of the reasons is you want to die because there are actually interactions you get with the character who is death. A Grim Reaper, I believe his name is Dennis, I can't remember, but maybe it's Roger the Reaper, I can't remember, I think it rhymes. But the point is, there are things that happen when you die and cutscenes you would miss if you never died, and I think the game is kind of punishing a little bit on purpose. There's also a very large amount of different attacks or obstacles that will kill you in one shot, which I know a lot of people, like, I've seen I've seen a few people on YouTube let's play this game, including a friend of mine who did it because I told him he should. And most people get pretty frustrated with this game and how punishing it can be at time.
One thing people like about the game is that the button commands are context based, so you don't have to learn a whole bunch of different button combinations. Like you're pressing the B button or the A button, and depending on the level you're in, like pushing the same button will do like a different thing.
Yeah, and the game does a good job of introducing that, the context sensitive. The only problem is there's also like a couple of sections in the game. Well, basically the entire Dracula part of the game, where you get to wield either a crossbow or a shotgun. The controls for the shotgun and the crossbow are extremely wonky, partially because you're kind of going from a third person 3D platformer into a first person shooter almost at times, and that is very jarring and difficult. But on the whole, yeah, most times where you have to use special buttons or a different thing, it will explain it explicitly as well, and the game pauses to tell you how to do it. So I think that's pretty good.
I've heard towards the end of the game, shooting becomes much more a part of the gameplay, and apparently the shooting is very difficult.
Yeah, that's part of what I was alluding to with the crossbow and the shotgun in the horror level. Like, that's very difficult. I think the other shooting though is in the Matrix level. I never thought that one was difficult because you're basically flipping in slow motion, and you use the joystick to like try to shoot the people, like the guards who are trying to stop you. And that one was pretty easy. I always found, but I don't know. I might be in the minority over that one. Maybe it was just because rule of cool goes a long way for me, and I just thought that level was fun and cool. But definitely, yeah, when you need to shoot the shotgun, it is one of those cases where like in some games you get this point where like you have to hold the controller in a different way in order to do a section of the game, and that's definitely what happens for that one.
And finally, I've heard people praise the boss battles for being creative.
I mean, yes and no. It's because here's the thing, a lot of them still use the basic rule of threes. Like you do the same thing 3 times, each time it changes a little bit, and then you manage to defeat the person. Although some of them are a little more original, and oh yeah, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of the boss battles also have other things that happen around them. So you will, for example, after you defeat the Terminator Doombot, suddenly the water levels are rising, and there's these cables that will electrify you if they hit the water and you're still in the water. And so I like the fact that they don't just end. Like if you beat Dracula, you still need to get out of his castle, and now there are other monsters trying to attack you. So it definitely is a game that doesn't just end with the boss battle. And again, there's a narrative to almost every battle, which is really fun. And I guess, yeah, I guess I didn't think about it, but yeah, the context sensitive things does make it so you can have a lot of fun, if not original, ways to beat bosses. Like, you have to throw toilet paper in the Great Mighty Pooh's mouth in order to defeat him while he's singing opera. The mechanic is very similar to some other boss battles, but the fact that there is so much humor and story in it does kind of make up for, I guess, some of those resemblances.
So would you say that the strengths of this game are more in the story and the humor and the cutscenes rather than the actual gameplay?
Absolutely. But I also I do know this game has a bad rep for its gameplay, and I think that although yes, there are problems with it, I don't think it's as jarring as some people seem to think about it or remember it, because like I think it's just because people remember getting stuck on certain parts of the game, and you definitely will get stuck on certain parts of the game, but once you get through those, the rest of it I think is definitely worth it.
Oh, you're making Jam Jam sad. Yeah, the original creators of this game have come out and said that they don't seem interested in making another one of these, and that if they were to make another Conker's game, that you would want a different group of people making it. There was no sequel to Conker's Bad Fur Day. It did not do well commercially, but it definitely developed cult classic status because gaming critics and people who actually played the game really enjoyed it. People like Beef Pork Ribs here. So I think they tried bringing back the Conker character for like some short-lived game. It was like some kind of Microsoft fan inclusion thing, and it just didn't go anywhere. So it seems unlikely we'll ever get another game like this. And I think that honestly, it preserves this game as a cult classic. The fact that there's never been another game quite like it.
Yeah, it's part of the kind of intellectual properties that Microsoft tried to do something with, but it never really worked. And the expression "lightning doesn't strike twice." Being as you've lived in Toronto, the place where lightning strikes the most often in the same place, that's not true. But at the same time, the expression does kind of hold here. Like, I don't think, like, just the fact that the first game exists would automatically make the second game less surprising and therefore not work as well.
Yeah, like I think of something like even the Anchorman movie. It was just so chock full of like surprising humor that when they eventually made a sequel, it just didn't live up to the hype. So maybe it's a good thing
Because
that
they repeated a lot of the same jokes
Yes.
instead of making something that was shocking again. And it is really hard to do two things that are completely shocking. I mean, it's one of the reason in the new Borat movie they don't focus on as much on Borat because, well, he's well known and he couldn't have the same shock factor as he did originally, and so you have to change up what you're doing, and it is very hard to do. And also, I feel like this game definitely has the energy. When a show has like 2 or 3 seasons figured out and they've got all the ideas for it, and then it gets popular and they're forced to go further, but they just have no idea what they're going to do. I feel like that's kind of what happened with this game. Like, they had all their good ideas, they developed them, they put them in a game together, but I don't think they have that, like, people have enough ideas to make another one.
So coming around to final thoughts, I guess, Conker's Bad Fur Day is indeed a very good example of something that's a cult classic. Was not received well commercially, but has grown quite the audience. And as Beef Pork Ribs has told us, it's hard to get a copy of this game. It was only released on the Nintendo 64. There was like a remastered version made for the original Xbox, which I don't know if it's any better or worse than the N64 version.
I
But
can officially tell you it is worse. The textures are terrible, but then, sorry. So Conker's Reloaded. Something in it. Yeah, Conker's Reloaded was terrible because they tried to update the textures and try to give Conker actual fur, and it looks terrible. But they also had the rare replay for the, I think it was for the Xbox 360, where they basically just re-released their N64 games with slight graphic upgrades, but basically almost as is for the Xbox, and that was great.
So having not played the game myself, I don't really feel like I can give it a back cookie rating. So we'll leave the official podcast ranking of this game to you, Beeper.
5 out of 4. I mean, I honestly, for my personal enjoyment, I want to give it where we do 4, right? 4 out of 4.
Yeah.
But honestly, because there are some wonky parts of it, and there are some parts that haven't aged well, I think I still can give it a solid 3.5 to 3.7. We'll call it 3.6, split the difference, because I still think it's a highly enjoyable game, a proof of not a proof, but an example of a passion project, and something that I think just has more good things than bad.
So Conker's Bad Fur Day. If you own a Nintendo 64, you might be able to get a copy of it. If what we've said today has gotten you interested, I would suggest maybe looking at the cutscenes that are on YouTube and treating it like a movie.
You'll miss out on the frustrating part of the experience, but you will get a lot of the humor. Most of it. If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So, getting to the point of deciding what we're going to talk about next week, I have gone and seen Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And Beeper, I don't know for next week, should we go to Sonic 2 or should we go to the pulling something out of the bat jar?
I will say let's go for Sonic 2.
All right. I won't say anything about it. I will just say, okay, no, I just said I wouldn't say anything, so I shouldn't say anything. Great. So for anybody who's listening to this, who celebrates Easter, hope you had a very happy Easter. I guess this will go out on Easter Monday, so the day everyone uses to travel back to their homes. I know I have a Winter Tire appointment today, so as this is being released, I'm probably sitting in a Canadian Tire waiting for my tires to be changed. But yes, if you celebrate Easter, hope you had a happy Easter. If you celebrate other holidays this time of the year, hope you had a good version of that. But come back to the Batchar podcast next week when we talk about Sonic the Hedgehog 2. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
Long time. Love manual long time.